The IMF has warned Australia needs to change its tax system to pay for COVID spending, including cutting capital gains tax. The health system tops the National Cabinet agenda today as the Productivity Commission adds its support to allowing pharmacists and nurses to do more, and the $5 note to get a facelift, but King Charles III won't be on it. It's Friday, the 3rd of February 2023. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, immediately after the show, a little bit different today's chat. You're speaking with Peter Petroulis, the CEO of WizButler.
WizButler, what a great name. WIZBUTLER, WizButler. Basically, it's software that allows restaurateurs to sell space rather than tables. And the outcome of that is that restaurateurs can actually book kind of 80, 90% of their tables online rather than the 60, 65%, which is what happens when you're only booking tables rather than space. A really interesting use of technology to help that sector. So it's well worth a listen, Michael.
Yeah, indeed. And the fact that he works in that space, has come up with this idea, and it's worth a fortune.
Yeah, that's right. He patented the technology. It was valued at $275 million. Incredible.
Yeah. It is a great story. It's coming up a little bit later on. But the main story this morning, Sean, the International Monetary Fund has called on Australia to reform its tax system to pay for the budget deficit, as Treasurer Jim Chalmers said that abolishing the Stage 3 tax cuts due to kick in next year isn't on the table.
Yes. Now, plenty in this morning. The International Monetary Fund urged the government to wind back capital gains tax breaks for the family home and to broaden the GST to help pay for spending in coming years. We know the budget deficit is going to be huge for many, many years. And now that the economy is doing okay, our minds are turning to how we fix that. The IMF also suggested any windfall revenue in the May budget due to higher commodity prices should be banked and not spent. So the Federal Treasury reckons iron ore prices will average around, off the top of my head, it's somewhere between $55 and $80. They're around $120. Coal prices certainly will have estimated lower than what they actually are. So what the IMF is saying is take all that windfall and put it in the bank, pay down some debt. That in turn would ease pressure on the Reserve Bank, which means it might not have to lift interest rates as much.
All right, pretty kind of broad-ranging comments from the IMF. What do they say about the economy? Will Australia end up in recession?
Well, it's a very good question. The IMF reckons the local economy will tread a narrow path to avoid recession, but it says it will only grow by 1.6% this year. It forecasts unemployment to rise to 4% on the back of higher interest rates and weaker consumer spending. It called on the government to revisit the $60 billion of capital gains tax concessions that flow from the sale of people's residence. Now, that might be a good idea in policy terms, but it's also a sure way to lose the next election, Michael. The IMF also thinks that we should increase the GST. I reckon that's in the same basket. Might be a good idea in terms of policy, but a sure way to lose the next election.
Yeah, so what was the government's response then?
Well, I mean, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers came out and says the independent assessment backs the government's strategy. He would say that. He also added that the government's priority is to tax multinationals and improve compliance, as opposed to changing the GST or changing capital gains tax rules. In that process, he was asked about the Stage 3 tax cuts, which are due to kick in next year, very much middle income tax cuts. He reiterated what they were saying last year, very much that those Stage 3 tax cuts are still going ahead.
Yeah, you compare that, increasing the GST with taxing multinationals, and you're not going to kind of alienate too many people by focusing on the latter, are you?
No, you're not.
All right, how about local markets? What happened yesterday?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 closed up a touch to 7,512 points. It started really strongly, and in early trading was only about 1% below its all-time high of April last year, but it fell back during the day. Now, the reason for the strong start was Wall Street, which I'll talk about more shortly. It was a great day for the tech stocks. Xero jumped 7.5% to $82.60. WiseTech Global was up nearly 7%. To $63.53. It wasn't so good for QBE Insurance, which was the worst of the top 200, falling nearly 5%. CSL was a standout, up 1%, hitting a 52-week high. Macquarie Group was up almost 2%, while the retailers, Wesfarmers, Woolworths and Coles all did well. But the iron ore miners, the banks and the energy companies all went backwards. Very hard to have a strong day on the ASX when you have the iron ore companies, the banks and the energy groups going backwards, Michael.
Yeah, and what about international markets?
Well, the past 36 hours have been all about the US Federal Reserve and interest rates. Now, the Fed's Policy Committee lifted the central bank's key rate by 25 basis points, as expected, and signalled further rate rises. But 25 basis points is less than last year's increments, and investors are finally seeing a light at the end of the interest rate hiking cycle. Maybe it's a light at the end of the interest rate hiking tunnel, Michael.
It feels like you're stretching that one just a little bit, Sean.
Yeah, perhaps.
Just trying to force it to fit.
Perhaps. But that sentiment helped Wall Street surge, with the tech-heavy Nasdaq jumping more than 2% yesterday morning, while the broad-based S&P was up 1%. Helping support tech stocks was the earnings announcement from Meta Platforms. Think Instagram, think Facebook. Revenue was above estimates, suggesting digital ad sales are rebounding. In extended trading, Meta's share price was up about 10%. Very good news for that company. Michael, yesterday the Australian dollar hit an 8-month high of 71.57 US cents. That's on the back of the Fed's announcement. Bond yields, which reflect expectations of future interest rate levels, fell back. Cryptocurrencies also benefited, with Bitcoin hitting its highest level since August last year, pushing above 24,000 US dollars a unit. And finally, oil prices fell back a bit as US figures show a big rise in crude inventories. Plenty going on.
Yeah, there sure is. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, National Cabinet meets today and the health system is expected to be top of the agenda, with premiers likely to actually ask for more money for hospitals.
Yes, definitely. Now, look, the meeting comes just as a Productivity Commission report released yesterday bolsters the case for overhauling Medicare to allow allied health professionals, people like pharmacists, physios, nurses, to take on tasks traditionally done by doctors. That's something that doctors thus far have fought very hard against. In today's meeting, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will provide premiers with the findings of the government's Strengthening Medicare Task Force, which is expected to recommend expanding rebates to other health professionals. That's just another way of saying physios, pharmacists, nurses will take on some of those GP tasks. The task force will also put less emphasis on the traditional fee-for-service model in favour of block funding for multidisciplinary teams of health professionals to provide care, particularly to chronic conditions. Now, according to the Financial Review, one of its most controversial recommendations may be to give pharmacists power to prescribe some medicines. That will cause a furore because GPs want to be the people that prescribe medicines. And just before we leave this story, Michael, the PC report also says that more than 3 million Australians clogged up emergency rooms last year when they should have seen a GP instead.
That is a lot of people.
Yeah, incredible amount.
Yeah, indeed. Now, we mentioned this one at the top of the show, Sean. The Reserve Bank will update the $5 note, dropping the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II and not replacing her with King Charles III.
Yes, instead it will feature a new design, which will take some years to actually develop, that honours the culture and history of First Australians. Now, the bank said it will consult with First Australians on the design. It isn't exactly a new idea. I mean, the first $1 note in 1966 included imagery of Aboriginal rock paintings and carvings, and the first $10 polymer banknote included examples of ancient and contemporary Aboriginal art. Now, while members of the government welcomed the decision, not everyone was happy, Michael, about King Charles III not making it onto the $5 note. Opposition leader Peter Dutton called it another attack on our systems, on our society and our institutions. Really? I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. Now, Sean, talks between Canada's Brookfield and US private equity group EIG Partners and Origin Energy continue, but the consortium might come back with a lower priced offer.
The two companies started due diligence on Origin last November. They're still at it. Now, reports yesterday suggest the group might come back with a lower bid, lower than the current $9 a share offer. Apparently, the two think that changes in the regulatory environment, particularly the federal government's gas price cap, has altered the playing field, which gives them a reason to offer less. We'll see how that one turns out.
Now, this next one, Sean, is a bit confronting, though it's not necessarily surprising. The Australian Energy Regulator says there's been a 12% increase in people struggling to pay their power bills and that retailers need to improve support for customers.
Yes, appearing before a Senate inquiry into the cost of living yesterday, Chair Claire Savage said 2.5% of all customers have 90-day debt averaging about $1,000, and 1/4 of customers who are identified for hardship customers have debts of $2,500. Now, Savage said retailers should be doing more in terms of early identification of hardship customers, but 2.5%, 90-day debt averaging $1,000, that is tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, that is a lot of people in fairly significant stress.
Yeah.
Now, there's an interesting report in the Financial Review, Sean, about Australian companies, after being frozen out for 3 years, courting China again as President Xi Jinping attempts to reboot the world's second largest economy.
So Fortescue boss Andrew Forrest, Rio Tinto's Jakob Stausholm, and Treasury Estates' Tim Ford, whose company was absolutely hammered by the extreme tariffs on wine imports in China, are all due on the mainland in the next couple of months. And the heads of all 8, group of 8 universities are planning to visit China by the middle of the year. China, of course, is a major market for fee-paying students for our major universities. Now, it comes as the government yesterday confirmed that Trade Minister Don Farrell will meet his Chinese counterpart online next week. It really does feel as if trade between the two countries is going to accelerate. Mind you, I reckon Aussie businesses will be a little more circumspect about doing business with China than they were a few years ago, simply because of the tariffs that were imposed. And that's kind of the long-term problem with trade restrictions, be that in China or in the US or wherever, is it just makes those economies more difficult to work with.
Yeah, though, Sean, the highlight for me of that story was your reference to Treasury Wine Estates being hammered by the tariffs. It's a fantastic choice of words.
I'm trying to get my head around that. Treasury Wine Estates being hammered by the tariffs. Oh, right.
Yes, that's okay. So clearly it wasn't deliberate. We will move on. On a related kind of topic, Sean, Beijing has denounced a proposal to add Japan and India to the AUKUS Defence Technology Pact, accusing Washington, Canberra and London of fueling military confrontation through military collaboration.
China's foreign ministry said it was seriously concerned about and opposed to AUKUS, according to the Australian newspaper. Asked about a proposal by the chair of Britain's Defence Select Committee for Japan and India to join the AUKUS Pact, China's foreign ministry said the original 3-country security partnership was already destabilising the region and being driven by Cold War thinking.
Sean, workers aren't flocking back to CBDs just yet, with the national office vacancy rates rising in Sydney and Melbourne centres.
Yes, although partly it's because more supply has come onto the market. Overall, net demand in Sydney was negative during the last 6 months of 2022, pushing the vacancy rate to 11.3%. In Melbourne, it was also negative. The vacancy rate there is 13.8%. Nationally, the vacancy rate is about 12.5%. Now, the city that did do well late last year, was Brisbane. It fell back below 13% after more than 40,000 square metres was let. Hobart and Darwin also tightened. Canberra and Perth were flat. Now, Michael, I'd ask you the question, have you noticed more traffic in CBDs, in Sydney, the one where we live? I don't think you've been out of your house for about 6 months.
I do my best to avoid it.
Yeah, I was in town this week and it was really busy. It was great to see.
Yes, well, I mean, Sean, we very briefly met up in town at one point and we had a bit of a fear and greed meeting. And look, all I can say is head to the Fear and Greed Instagram page, which is Fear and Greed Podcast, because we took a bit of a team photo, you, me and Adam, and I have been criticised a little for my attire at our meeting.
Rightly criticised, can I add?
No. And so, look, go cast your judgment, have your say, and I'm looking for anyone to support me, please. Now, Sean, a serious one to finish on. Opposition leader Peter Dutton and former Prime Ministers John Howard and Tony Abbott joined more than 1,000 mourners yesterday to farewell Cardinal George Pell in Sydney's St Mary's Cathedral.
The 2-hour funeral included a eulogy from Abbott. The eulogy highlighted that Pell was the only person to ever have been Archbishop of both Melbourne and Sydney. Abbott said the Cardinal was the greatest Catholic Australia has ever produced and one of the country's greatest sons. He likened the cardinal, who spent 400 days in jail after being convicted of sexual assault, a conviction that was later overturned, as a saint, and said his experiences were akin to a modern-day crucifixion. Outside the church, hundreds of protesters demonstrated, with many tying ribbons to their wrists in tribute to victims of sexual abuse. Now, Michael, that's a very serious story. Just before we get on to the overseas news, I have a question for you.
Oh, no, I know what's coming.
You know what it's going to be. So yesterday, we recorded just a very small snippet, a couple of lines. In fact, I'll read you what we recorded.
Oh, do you have to do this, Sean?
Yeah. But for some reason, it didn't appear in the show. So all it said was, and finally, an update on a story from earlier in the week. The 8mm radioactive capsule lost by Rio Tinto somewhere along a 1,400-kilometre road in Western Australia has been found. The capsule was found just south of the mining town of Newman. Interesting story. I listened to the show yesterday. The producer of the show, i.e. Michael Thompson, whom only a couple of days ago guaranteed us that that capsule would never, ever be found, seems to have cut the story out of the show.
Look, Sean, context is important here. Every show, we try and keep it to a reasonable length. And sometimes when a show is running over, one or all of us together, but on this particular occasion it was just one of us, has to make difficult editorial decisions. And I made the decision to cut that story because I didn't think...
Censorship.
I didn't think I needed to be shown up in that way.
Censorship. So let's recap. So you said there is no way in the world, needle in a haystack, no way that on a 1,400-kilometre stretch of road you're going to find something 8mm by 6mm. 2 days later, they found it. I suppose they've got things like Geiger counters. I don't even know what a Geiger counter is, but something that detects radioactive waste or something.
Yeah, look, I mean, they lost something, they found something. It's a non-story really, Sean, isn't it?
Shame, shame, shame.
Yeah, I'm sorry. All right, moving on to overseas news now, Sean. And Auckland has recorded its wettest month since records began 170 years ago, according to the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research.
Yeah, I had to put in the name of the organisation, the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. I like it. NIWAR. New Zealand's largest city had a total of 539 millimetres of rain last month, smashing the previous monthly record of 420 millimetres. Nothing in the observational record has come close to what we've seen in the past few weeks, says Anthony Fowler, Honorary Associate Professor from the School of Environment at the University of Auckland. He, Professor Fowler, is the weather guru, apparently. Now, these records date back to 1853. In total, Central Auckland experienced more than 45% of its yearly rainfall in just 1 month, more than 8.5 times the amount of a typical January, and about 2.5 times that of an entire summer. Incredible downpours.
Finally, Sean, this is an interesting one. One of the challenges that many businesses contend with is how much to allow or even to encourage staff to be on social media. One Japanese trading company is encouraging staff to be YouTubers or to be artists in an effort to actually retain staff.
Yes, I think this is very creative. So anyone trying to hire labour at the moment just understands how tough it is to find people. Mitsui, which is a big financial conglomerate in Japan, has dropped its ban on side jobs and will now let employees earn money elsewhere, according to Bloomberg. The move reflects a drive among companies to adopt much more flexible working conditions in order to woo younger workers. Japan's population is in decline. Younger workers are very, very valuable, particularly since the pandemic. So Mitsui started with remote work, then went to flexible hours, and this is in a very hierarchical, traditional workforce. Now they're allowing people to have side jobs, and that could be coaching, working on a tech startup, or, as they said, becoming a YouTuber or an artist. There you go.
There you go, indeed. All right, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Peter Petroulis, CEO of WizButler.
Yes, all about selling space rather than tables in restaurants and how technology is being used to make more money for restaurants and cafes. Great little interview.
Yeah, great one for entrepreneurs. That's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Sean, we've gone a little bit overtime today, so now I'm going to have to decide which story made me look the worst and just cut that one out entirely.
Yeah. Now, look, any listeners out there, please feel free to comment on Michael's censorship. Outrageous. That's what I'd say.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael. Enjoy your day.
It's Friday, the 3rd of February, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us on LinkedIn, on Instagram, as I mentioned, Twitter and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.